So this whole thing started when my girlfriend told me I should be thanking other guys for hitting on her. Yeah, you read that right. She actually said I should be grateful that random dudes were trying to get with her because it proved how lucky I was. The worst part wasn't even that she said it. It was how she laughed when she said it, like I was supposed to find it funny too. I mean, who says that to their boyfriend? Anyway, I ended up recording her saying it again later because nobody believed me when I told them. That recording changed everything. Sometimes you don't realize how toxic someone is until you hear their own words played back to them. So I'm Chris, 27M, marketing specialist. I work at this mid-sized company downtown. Nothing too exciting, but it pays the bills. I'd been dating Sarah for about 8 months at this point. She was 25, worked in retail management, and honestly seemed pretty great at first. We met through mutual friends and hit it off right away. The thing about Sarah was that she was really outgoing and social. I'm more of an introvert, so I actually liked that about her initially. She could work a room, make friends easily, that sort of thing. I thought it balanced us out well. She was always getting invited to parties and events, and she dragged me along even when I'd rather stay home and watch Netflix. Looking back, there were probably red flags earlier that I just ignored or rationalized away, like how she'd always mention when guys at work complimented her, or how she'd point out when waiters were being extra friendly. At the time, I thought she was just being open and honest about her day. I figured it was better than hiding things, right? We had this friend group that we'd hang out with pretty regularly. Most of them were her friends first, but they seemed to like me well enough. There was Jake, Emma, Marcus, and a few others who'd rotate in and out depending on what we were doing. They were all pretty social people like Sarah, which meant lots of parties and group hangouts. The problems really started becoming obvious at social events. Sarah would get this extra energy around other people, especially guys. She'd laugh louder, touch people more, just generally amp up her personality. I told myself it was just her being friendly and that I was being insecure. But something about it always made me uncomfortable, and I couldn't really put my finger on why. So we were at Jake's house for his birthday party. It was a pretty typical weekend thing. Maybe 15 or 20 people, music playing, everyone drinking and having a good time. I was nursing a beer in the kitchen when I noticed Sarah across the room talking to this guy I'd never seen before. He was clearly into her, leaning in close, making her laugh, the whole 9 yards. I watched them for a while, trying to gauge if this was just normal conversation or something more. The guy kept finding excuses to touch her arm or shoulder, and she wasn't exactly pulling away. She had this big smile on her face and was playing with her hair, which she always did when she was flirting. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, but tried to push it down. After about 20 minutes of this, I walked over to join the conversation. I introduced myself as Sarah's boyfriend, and the guy seemed surprised. He said something about how Sarah hadn't mentioned having a boyfriend, which made me look at her. She just shrugged and said she didn't think it was relevant to their conversation about work or whatever they were talking about. The guy eventually wandered off, but Sarah seemed annoyed that I'd interrupted. She pulled me aside and asked why I was being so possessive. I told her I wasn't being possessive, but that watching her flirt with random guys wasn't exactly fun for me. That's when she said something that really caught me off guard. She told me I was being ridiculous and that I should actually be thanking guys like that. I asked her what she meant, and she explained that when other men hit on her, it proved how attractive and desirable she was, which meant I was lucky to be with her. She said I should appreciate that other guys wanted what I had instead of getting jealous about it. The way she said it was so casual, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She had this little smirk on her face, and she actually laughed when she finished explaining her logic. I just stood there staring at her, not really sure how to respond. Part of me wondered if she was joking, but her expression made it clear she was completely serious. I told her that wasn't how relationships worked, that I didn't need other guys hitting on my girlfriend to feel good about myself. She rolled her eyes and said I was being insecure and that most guys would love to have a girlfriend that other men found attractive. She said it like I was the weird one for not seeing it her way. The rest of the party was pretty awkward. I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said, and every time I saw her talking to another guy, I wondered if she was thinking about how grateful I should be. She seemed completely unbothered by our conversation and went right back to being her usual social self. When we got home that night, I tried to bring it up again. I asked her if she really believed what she'd said about me thanking other guys. She said of course she did, and that if I was more confident, I'd see it the same way. She made it sound like my discomfort was a personal failing rather than a reasonable response to her behavior. I went to bed that night feeling really confused and frustrated. I couldn't tell if I was being too sensitive or if what she'd said was actually as messed up as it seemed to me. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out if there was some way her logic made sense that I was missing. The next few days were weird. I couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said at the party, and I found myself paying more attention to how she interacted with other people. At work, I was distracted and kept checking my phone to see if she'd texted me about her day. Usually she'd mention if anything interesting happened, including interactions with customers or coworkers. I decided to talk to Marcus about it when we grabbed lunch on Tuesday. I didn't want to air all our dirty laundry, but I needed someone else's perspective on whether I was overreacting. I told him about the party and what Sarah had said about me being grateful for other guys hitting on her. Marcus got this uncomfortable look on his face and said that was a pretty weird thing for her to say. But then he got quiet and seemed like he wanted to say something else, but wasn't sure if he should. I pressed him on it, and he finally admitted that some of the group had noticed Sarah being pretty flirty at social events. He said they'd talked about it among themselves, but didn't want to get involved in our relationship. That hit me like a punch to the gut. Knowing that our friends had not only noticed, but actually discussed Sarah's behavior made everything feel more real and serious. I asked Marcus what exactly they'd seen, and he said it was just little things, the way she'd touch guys when she talked to them, how she'd laugh at everything they said, how she seemed to seek out male attention at parties. He was quick to say that he'd never seen her do anything really inappropriate, just that her behavior seemed like she was single rather than in a relationship. He said Emma had mentioned it to him because she thought it was disrespectful to me, but they hadn't known how to bring it up or if they even should. I felt embarrassed that our friends had been watching this dynamic play out and probably feeling sorry for me. I wondered how long they'd been talking about it and what else they might have noticed that I'd missed or ignored. Marcus tried to reassure me that they weren't judging me, but I could tell this had been an ongoing conversation in the group. When I got home that evening, Sarah was in a particularly good mood. She told me about her day and mentioned that a customer had complimented her outfit and asked if she was single. She seemed to think this was a funny story and was laughing as she told it. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She looked at me with that same smirk from the party and said I should probably send that customer a thank you card for recognizing how lucky I was. She was clearly referencing what she'd said at Jake's party, but saying it again made it clear that she wasn't just having an off night. This was actually how she thought about these situations. I asked her if she was serious, and she said of course she was. She said attractive women get hit on all the time, and that secure men appreciate having desirable partners instead of getting threatened by it. She made it sound like some kind of relationship wisdom that I was too immature to understand. I told her that most people would find her attitude disrespectful, and she laughed and said most people were just jealous that they didn't have what we had. She said I was lucky she was honest about these interactions instead of hiding them like some girlfriends would. She actually seemed proud of herself for being so open about it. The conversation ended with her telling me I needed to work on my confidence and security issues. She said she wasn't going to change who she was or how she interacted with people just because I was insecure. She made it clear that she saw this as my problem to solve, not hers to modify. By the weekend, I was feeling pretty lost about the whole situation. I'd been thinking about what Marcus said and wondering if I was missing something obvious about Sarah's behavior. Part of me still hoped I was overreacting, but another part was starting to realize that maybe this was a bigger problem than I wanted to admit. Sarah suggested we go to this new cafe downtown for brunch on Saturday. She'd been wanting to try it, and I figured a public setting might be good for us. Maybe being around other people would help us have a normal, relaxed conversation without getting into heavy relationship stuff. The cafe was pretty busy when we got there, and we had to wait about 10 minutes for a table. While we were standing near the host station, this guy in line behind us started chatting with Sarah about the menu. He was asking her what looked good and making small talk about the wait time. I watched the interaction unfold, and it was like seeing everything Marcus had described in real time. Sarah was being extra animated, laughing at things that weren't particularly funny, and standing closer to the guy than she needed to. She introduced herself, but didn't mention that I was her boyfriend, even though I was standing right there. When we finally got seated, the guy made some comment about hoping to see her there again sometime. Sarah smiled and said she'd probably be back soon since she lived nearby. After he walked away, she turned to me with that familiar expression and said I should probably buy that guy a coffee for having such good taste in women. Something about hearing her say it again, so casually and confidently, made me realize I needed proof of what was happening. I felt like I was going crazy, and I knew that if I tried to tell our friends about this conversation, it would sound unbelievable. Who says stuff like that to their boyfriend? I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app. I wasn't really planning anything elaborate. I just wanted to capture her saying this stuff so I could listen to it later and make sure I wasn't misremembering or exaggerating. I set the phone on the table between us, partially hidden under my napkin. I brought up what she'd just said about buying the guy coffee and asked her to explain again why she thought I should be grateful when other men hit on her. She was happy to elaborate, clearly thinking she was educating me about how relationships should work. She told me that when you have an attractive partner, other people wanting them is validation of your good taste. She said insecure people get threatened by attention their partners receive, but confident people see it as confirmation that they chose well. She explained that I should feel proud when other men found her attractive because it meant I was with someone desirable. The recording captured everything: her tone, her confidence, even her little laugh when she finished explaining. She sounded so sure of herself, like she was stating obvious facts rather than expressing a controversial opinion. Hearing it played back later, even I was surprised by how casual and matter-of-fact she sounded. She went on to say that if I really loved her, I'd want her to feel appreciated and admired, even if that attention came from other men. She said trying to control or limit her interactions with people was selfish and showed that I didn't trust her. She made it sound like my discomfort was a character flaw that I needed to work on. I asked her what she would think if I said the same thing about women hitting on me, and she said that would be different because men and women interact differently. She said women don't typically approach men the same way, so it wasn't a fair comparison. When I pressed her on it, she said she'd probably think it was weird if I was actively encouraging female attention. The double standard was so obvious, but she didn't seem to see any contradiction in what she was saying. She genuinely believed that her logic was sound and that I was the one with the problem. The recording captured all of this, including her dismissive tone when I tried to challenge her reasoning. By the end of our conversation, I had about 15 minutes of audio that clearly demonstrated her attitude about the situation. I felt relieved to have concrete evidence of what she was saying, but also disturbed by how comfortable she seemed with her position. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad day. This was how she actually thought about our relationship. I spent Sunday listening to the recording from the cafe and trying to decide what to do with it. Hearing Sarah's words played back was even more jarring than experiencing the conversation in real time. Her tone was so dismissive and condescending, like she was explaining something obvious to a child who wasn't getting it. I knew I needed to confront her about this whole situation, but I wasn't sure how to approach it. Part of me wanted to play the recording right away and see how she reacted to hearing herself. Another part thought I should try one more time to have a reasonable conversation before bringing out what felt like nuclear evidence. Monday evening, I decided to bring it up again. Sarah was making dinner, and I thought maybe a domestic, comfortable setting would help us have a more productive discussion. I told her I'd been thinking about our conversation at the cafe and that I was still struggling with her perspective on other men hitting on her. She sighed and said she thought we'd already covered this. She reminded me that she'd explained her reasoning and that the problem was my insecurity, not her behavior. She said she was getting tired of having the same conversation over and over when the solution was for me to work on my confidence issues. I told her that I'd talked to some friends about it, and that they agreed her attitude was unusual and potentially problematic. She asked who I'd been talking to, and when I mentioned Marcus, she rolled her eyes. She said Marcus was probably just jealous that he didn't have a girlfriend who got as much attention as she did. That's when I decided to play the recording. I pulled out my phone and told her I wanted her to hear how she sounded when she explained her position. I thought maybe hearing herself would give her some perspective on how her words came across. I was hoping she'd realize how dismissive and disrespectful she sounded. I played about 5 minutes of the recording, including the part where she explained why I should be grateful for other men's attention and the part where she said my discomfort was a character flaw. I watched her face as she listened, expecting to see some recognition or embarrassment about her tone and attitude. Instead, she started laughing. Not a nervous or uncomfortable laugh, but genuine amusement. She said she couldn't believe I'd recorded her and that it was pretty pathetic that I needed audio evidence to remember a simple conversation. She seemed more amused than offended or concerned about what the recording revealed. She said the recording just proved her point about my insecurity issues. She asked why I felt the need to secretly record our conversations if I trusted her and felt confident in our relationship. She made it sound like the recording was evidence of my problems rather than documentation of her problematic attitude. I told her I'd recorded it because I wanted to make sure I wasn't misremembering or exaggerating what she'd said. I explained that her position seemed so unusual that I wanted to be able to listen to it again and make sure I understood correctly. She said that was exactly the kind of overthinking that showed how insecure I was. She went back to making dinner like nothing had happened, occasionally chuckling about the fact that I'd recorded our conversation. She said she hoped I felt better now that I had proof of what she'd already told me multiple times. She seemed completely unbothered by hearing her own words played back and showed no signs of reconsidering her position. The whole interaction left me feeling more frustrated and confused than before. I'd expected the recording to be some kind of wake-up call for her, but instead it just seemed to reinforce her belief that I was the one with issues. She treated the whole thing like a joke, which somehow made it even worse than if she'd gotten angry about being recorded. I realized that night that Sarah wasn't going to change her mind or see my perspective no matter what evidence I presented. The recording had been meant to help her understand how she sounded, but instead it just showed me how little she cared about my feelings or concerns about our relationship. Tuesday after work, I went over to Marcus's place because I needed to talk through everything that had happened with the recording. I felt like I was losing my mind, and I needed someone else's perspective on whether I was handling this situation correctly or if I was missing something obvious. Marcus listened to parts of the recording and just shook his head. He said he couldn't believe Sarah had doubled down on her position even after hearing how she sounded. He said most people would be at least a little embarrassed to hear themselves being so dismissive of their partner's concerns, but Sarah seemed proud of what she'd said. I told him about how she'd laughed when I played the recording and how she'd made it seem like documenting our conversation was proof of my insecurity rather than evidence of her problematic attitude. Marcus said that was a classic manipulation tactic, turning the focus back on my behavior instead of addressing what she'd actually said. He asked me what I was planning to do next, and honestly, I wasn't sure. Part of me felt like I should break up with her, but we'd been together for 8 months, and I kept thinking maybe this was just a rough patch we could work through. I told Marcus I was worried I was overreacting to what might just be a difference in communication styles. Marcus was quiet for a while, then said he thought I should be careful about making any big decisions while I was feeling so emotional about everything. He said maybe I should take some time to think about whether this was really about the specific comments Sarah had made or if it was part of a larger pattern of behavior that bothered me. He suggested I pay attention to how Sarah treated me in other situations and whether she generally seemed to respect my feelings and concerns. He said the recording was pretty damning, but that one conversation shouldn't necessarily define an entire relationship. He thought I should give it a little more time to see if this was an isolated incident or part of a bigger problem. I appreciated Marcus trying to be balanced about the situation, but part of me felt like he was being too generous to Sarah. The recording wasn't just one bad conversation. It was her doubling down on a position that most people would find disrespectful and inappropriate. And her reaction to hearing the recording had been even worse than the original comments. Marcus said he understood my frustration, but that relationships were complicated and sometimes people said things they didn't really mean or hadn't thought through completely. He said maybe Sarah would come around if I gave her some space to process everything without feeling attacked or defensive. He suggested I try to have one more calm conversation with her about how her attitude affected me, without bringing up the recording or getting into an argument about who was right. He thought maybe if I approached it from a place of vulnerability rather than confrontation, she might be more receptive to understanding my perspective. I wasn't convinced that another conversation would change anything, but I agreed to think about it. Marcus said he'd support whatever decision I made, but that he thought I should be really sure before ending an 8-month relationship over this issue. He reminded me that Sarah had good qualities too, and that no relationship was perfect. We talked for a couple more hours about relationships in general, and whether there were certain things that should be deal breakers versus things you could work through with communication and compromise. Marcus shared some stories about conflicts he'd had with his ex-girlfriend and how they'd worked through them, though he admitted none of them involved anything quite like what Sarah had said. By the time I left his place, I felt a little calmer but still wasn't sure what my next move should be. I decided to give it a few more days and see if Sarah brought up our conversation or showed any signs of reconsidering her position. I figured if she really cared about our relationship, she'd want to address my concerns even if she didn't initially understand them. By Friday, nothing had changed. Sarah hadn't brought up our previous conversations, and she seemed to think everything was back to normal between us. She suggested we go out to dinner at this nice Italian place downtown, and I figured it might be a good opportunity to see how she behaved in a social setting now that I was more aware of her patterns. The restaurant was pretty busy, and our server was this friendly guy probably around our age. From the moment he came to our table, I could see Sarah switching into what I now recognized as her flirty mode. She was smiling extra bright, making lots of eye contact, and asking him personal questions about how long he'd worked there and whether he liked it. The server was clearly responding to her energy and spent way more time at our table than he did with other customers. He was making recommendations, joking around, and finding excuses to come back and check on us. Sarah was eating up the attention and seemed completely oblivious to how uncomfortable it was making me. About halfway through dinner, the server made some comment about how Sarah had great taste in wine, and she laughed and said she had good taste in everything. Then she looked at me with that familiar smirk and said I was lucky she chose me out of all her options. The server looked a little confused by the comment, but Sarah just kept smiling like she'd said something clever. After the server walked away, Sarah turned to me and said I should probably leave him a really big tip for recognizing how great she was. She said it with that same casual confidence I'd heard in all our previous conversations about this topic. It was like she genuinely believed she was sharing relationship wisdom with me. That's when I decided to play the recording from the cafe. I pulled out my phone and told Sarah I wanted her to hear something. She looked curious but not concerned, probably thinking I was going to show her a funny video or something. I played the part where she explained why I should be grateful for other men's attention. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Sarah's face went from curious to angry, and she demanded to know why I was playing that in public. I told her I wanted her to hear how she sounded when she talked about our relationship and other men. She said I was being ridiculous and that this wasn't the time or place for that kind of conversation. But it was too late. The server had been walking by our table and clearly heard part of the recording. He looked uncomfortable and quickly moved on to another table, but I could tell he'd caught enough to understand what was happening. A couple at the table next to us had also heard and were trying not to stare. Sarah was furious that I'd played the recording in public. She said I was trying to embarrass her and that it was manipulative to air our private conversations in front of strangers. She said she couldn't believe I'd stooped to something so petty and vindictive just to prove a point. I told her that the recording was just her own words and that if she was embarrassed by them, maybe she should think about why. I said I wasn't trying to humiliate her, but that I wanted her to understand how her attitude came across to other people. She said the only thing embarrassing was my behavior in playing private conversations in public. The server came back to check on us, clearly sensing the tension at our table. Sarah was still angry but trying to compose herself in front of him. She made some comment about how sorry she was that he had to witness relationship drama, and he just nodded and said he hoped everything was okay. After he left, Sarah leaned across the table and told me I'd crossed a line by playing that recording in public. She said she'd never been so embarrassed in her life and that she couldn't believe I'd chosen to handle our problems this way. She said it showed a complete lack of respect for her privacy and dignity. The tension at our table was getting worse, and I could tell other diners were starting to notice. Sarah was trying to keep her voice down, but her anger was obvious, and she kept gesturing with her hands as she talked. I felt bad about creating a scene, but I also felt like she needed to hear how her words sounded to other people. I told Sarah that I'd played the recording because I wanted her to understand my perspective and that maybe hearing herself would help her see how dismissive she'd been. She said that was no excuse for humiliating her in public and that there were better ways to handle relationship conflicts than embarrassing your partner in front of strangers. She said she felt ambushed and betrayed, and that she'd never expected me to use something she'd said in private against her in such a public way. I pointed out that she'd said the same things multiple times and seemed proud of her position, so I didn't understand why she'd be embarrassed by other people hearing it. That seemed to make her even angrier. She said there was a difference between having a private conversation with your boyfriend and having that conversation broadcast to strangers in a restaurant. She said I was being deliberately obtuse if I couldn't understand why she'd be upset about the recording being played in public. The server came back to refill our water glasses and Sarah immediately started talking to him again. But this time, instead of being flirty, she was trying to get him on her side. She told him she was sorry he had to witness such an uncomfortable situation and that she'd never been treated so disrespectfully by a partner before. The server looked really uncomfortable and said he didn't want to get involved in our personal business. But Sarah kept talking, saying she couldn't believe someone would record private conversations and then play them in public to try to win an argument. She was clearly trying to make me look like the bad guy. I felt embarrassed that she was dragging this random server into our conflict, but I also felt like I needed to defend myself. I told the server that the recording was just my girlfriend's own words and that I'd played it because she didn't seem to understand why her attitude was problematic. That's when Sarah really lost it. She said I was pathetic for trying to get validation from strangers and that the fact that I needed to record our conversations showed how insecure and controlling I was. She said she'd never been with someone who violated her privacy and then tried to justify it by claiming moral superiority. The server looked like he wanted to disappear, and I felt terrible for putting him in that position. But before I could apologize, he surprised me by saying that he'd heard enough of the recording to understand what was happening and that he thought Sarah's attitude was pretty disrespectful to me. Sarah's mouth fell open. She clearly hadn't expected him to take my side, especially after she'd tried so hard to get his sympathy. The server said he'd been in relationships where his partner encouraged attention from other people and that it had never felt good or healthy to him. He said he thought relationships should be about making each other feel secure and valued, not about making your partner grateful for other people's interest. Sarah just stared at him, apparently speechless for the first time since I'd known her. I think she'd been so sure that anyone hearing our conflict would automatically side with her. The server apologized for getting involved and said he needed to check on his other tables. After he left, Sarah sat there quietly for a few minutes, and I wondered if maybe hearing an outside perspective had finally gotten through to her. But when she started talking again, she was angrier than before. She said she couldn't believe a stranger had felt comfortable commenting on our relationship and that the whole situation was mortifying. She blamed me for creating the circumstances that led to our private business being discussed with restaurant staff. She said she'd never been so humiliated in her life. I tried to point out that the server had just confirmed what I'd been trying to tell her, that her attitude was disrespectful and hurtful. But she said she didn't care what some random waiter thought about our relationship and that his opinion was irrelevant to our problems. The rest of dinner was incredibly awkward. Sarah barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short, clipped responses to direct questions. She was clearly furious about the whole situation, but I could tell she was also shaken by the server's reaction to the recording. I think she genuinely believed that most people would see things her way. We drove home in complete silence. Sarah stared out the window the entire time, and I could feel the anger radiating off her. I kept thinking about what the server had said and how it had validated everything I'd been feeling about her behavior. It was a relief to know that I wasn't crazy or overly sensitive. When we got back to my apartment, Sarah immediately started packing her things. She said she couldn't stay there that night after what had happened at the restaurant. She said she needed space to think about whether she could be with someone who would violate her privacy and humiliate her in public. I tried to talk to her about the actual issue, her attitude about other men hitting on her, but she said that wasn't the problem anymore. She said the problem was that I'd recorded her without permission and then played it in public to embarrass her. She made it sound like those actions were worse than anything she'd said or done. She said she'd never been with someone who was so insecure that they needed to document conversations and get validation from strangers. She said it showed a level of distrust and manipulation that she wasn't sure she could get past. I felt like she was completely missing the point and focusing on everything except her own behavior. Over the next few days, word about what had happened at the restaurant spread through our friend group. I'm not sure if Sarah told people or if someone else had heard about it, but suddenly everyone seemed to know that we'd had a public fight involving a recording of some kind. Marcus called me Tuesday evening to check in. He said Emma had heard something about us having problems and wanted to know if I was okay. I gave him the basic rundown of what had happened at dinner, including the server's reaction to the recording. Marcus said he was glad someone else had confirmed that Sarah's attitude was problematic. He said Emma and some of the other girls in our group had been talking about Sarah's behavior at social events for a while. Apparently, it wasn't just the guys who had noticed her flirtiness. The women had picked up on it too and found it disrespectful. Marcus said they'd been wondering how long I was going to put up with it. I felt embarrassed that our problems had become group gossip, but I was also relieved to know that other people had noticed the same patterns I'd been seeing. It made me feel less crazy and more confident that my concerns were legitimate rather than just insecurity on my part. Sarah texted me Wednesday saying she'd been staying at her sister's place and that she needed more time to think about our relationship. She said she was having trouble getting past what had happened at the restaurant and that she wasn't sure she could trust me anymore. The irony of her talking about trust wasn't lost on me. I spent the rest of the week thinking about everything that had happened and trying to decide what I wanted to do. Part of me missed Sarah and wanted to try to work things out, but a bigger part of me realized that this conflict had revealed some fundamental incompatibilities in how we viewed relationships and respect. The recording had been meant to help her understand my perspective, but instead it had just shown me how little she cared about my feelings. Her reaction to hearing her own words had been more telling than the original comments themselves. By the following weekend, I'd made up my mind about what needed to happen. Sarah had texted me Friday, asking if we could meet to talk about everything. I suggested we meet at the same cafe where I'd made the original recording, partly because it felt appropriate and partly because I wanted to have the conversation in public. Sarah was already there when I arrived Saturday morning. She looked tired and stressed, which made me feel bad despite everything that had happened. I still cared about her and didn't want her to be miserable, but I also knew that caring about someone didn't mean accepting disrespectful behavior from them. She started by saying she'd done a lot of thinking over the past week and that she understood why I'd been upset about her comments regarding other men. She said she could see how her words might have come across as dismissive of my feelings, even though that hadn't been her intention. I appreciated that she was acknowledging the problem, but something about her tone made it seem like she was just saying what she thought I wanted to hear rather than expressing genuine understanding or remorse. She seemed to be going through the motions of an apology without really meaning it. She said she was willing to be more mindful of how she talked about interactions with other men if that would make me more comfortable. But then she said she still thought I'd crossed a line by recording her and playing it in public, and that she needed me to promise that would never happen again. I told her that I appreciated her willingness to consider my perspective, but that I didn't think she really understood why her attitude had been so hurtful. I said it wasn't just about the specific comments she'd made, but about the underlying lack of respect for my feelings and our relationship. I explained that when she laughed at the recording and dismissed my concerns, it had shown me that she didn't take our relationship or my feelings seriously. I said that someone who truly cared about their partner wouldn't repeatedly tell them to be grateful for other people's romantic attention. Sarah got defensive and said she'd been trying to help me become more confident and secure. She said she thought encouraging me to see other men's interest in her as validation rather than a threat would be good for my self-esteem. She made it sound like she'd been doing me a favor. That's when I realized she still didn't get it. Even in her apology, she was maintaining that her original position had been reasonable and that my reaction had been the problem. She was willing to modify her behavior to keep me happy, but she wasn't genuinely sorry for how she'd treated me. I told her that I didn't think we were compatible in terms of how we viewed relationships and respect. I said that I needed to be with someone who naturally wanted to make me feel secure and valued, not someone who had to be convinced that my feelings mattered. Sarah seemed surprised that I was ending things. She said she thought we were meeting to work through our problems, not to break up. She asked if I was really going to throw away 8 months over one disagreement, and I told her it wasn't about one disagreement. It was about a pattern of behavior and attitude. She said I was being dramatic and that all couples had conflicts they needed to work through. She said she was willing to compromise and that I should be willing to do the same. But I told her that some things weren't really about compromise. They were about basic respect and compatibility. The conversation ended with her saying she thought I was making a mistake and that I'd regret letting my insecurity ruin a good relationship. Even in the breakup conversation, she was still framing my concerns as character flaws rather than legitimate relationship issues. It confirmed that I was making the right decision. Epilogue. That was about 6 months ago, and I can honestly say I don't regret the decision to end things with Sarah. The whole experience taught me a lot about recognizing red flags and trusting my instincts when something feels off in a relationship. I realized that I'd been making excuses for behavior that was genuinely disrespectful because I didn't want to seem insecure or controlling. I still have that recording on my phone, though I've never played it for anyone else.